Hello, Rubber Von Ducker here, and today I'm going to be looking at West Ham's home, the London Stadium. And the reason for that is when I did my original review of the Premiership final, I know what to say about this situation with West Ham renting the London Stadium. It's often been considered a subsidy, and I agree with that assessment. But looking into it a little bit since I made that video, out of my own curiosity, I have become intrigued by the situation. So, for those who don't know, West Ham rent London Stadium for 2.5 million a year. There's also been some developments on the site to house fans, or football fans to be more accurate. It's obviously a legacy of the 2012 Olympics. It's been a hotly politically debated issue. So as I've said, they pay 2.5 million a year to rent the stadium. My understanding is that the hospitality or the concessions for food, the money actually goes to the stadium owners rather than West Ham, so they pick up revenue there. Equally, I believe that they're responsible for the stewarding of the stadium, which may have been an issue in recent years. I mean, they've only been there since 2016, but yeah, there's been a bit of an issue already. Now, the interesting aspect is when I get to this section here on Wikipedia that says Stadium Operate. Now, it goes into the fact that a French company called Vinci actually got the contract. They run the Stadia de France in Paris, amongst other venues in Paris. So they're a bit of a specialist in stadium ownership and rental. They were competing with another company here who ran the O2, but they won the contract. Initially it was believed it was going to be a 10-year contract, but they actually ended up signing a 25-year contract in 2015, and they're also responsible for the London Marathon Charitable Trust Community Track. God, that's a ridiculously long name. And events on the South Park lawn. It's the first stadium outside of France they managed, and they set up a subsidiary company called London Stadium 185 to run it. And then in January 2019, the London Legacy Development Corporation, who are the organisation who are effectively trustees of the infrastructure created for the Olympics 2012, bought out Vinci, which I presume is at Vinci's request, because it seems to me that this specialist in stadium operation couldn't make the situation work financially. In fact, they turned in a 3.5 million loss. Presumably that was for the 2018 year. That's very interesting. They made a loss of 3.5 million on a stadium they're renting out for 2.5 million. They do have other events go on. Obviously, occasionally there's athletics, although I think that is relatively rare. And I don't suppose the athletics necessarily makes any money. But they also put on concerts, and we can see here some of the concerts. Now, at the point when Vinci pulled out, would be about here, in the previous year, they'd had the Foo Fighters play 2 dates, so presumably it was sold out for a figure of probably about 126, 130,000, presumably. Can't say for sure, because there's no attendance posted. The week prior, they had Beyonce and Jay-Z, probably the biggest acts on earth together, 126,000. They had the Rolling Stones, 137,000. 2 dates again, as was Beyonce and Jay-Z. They made a 3.5 million loss. How do you make that kind of loss? Well, because your costs are too big is a simple answer. So yeah, the current situation with West Ham seems to indicate that the stadium owners are going to keep making a loss, and that shouldn't be a surprise to us. 2.5 million rent a year on a stadium that's got a 66,000 capacity for seated is ridiculously cheap, especially in 2016, that's when they effectively took over. So it's been 3 years and the company walked away, gave it back to the London Legacy Group. Not a good sign. And like I say, it's ridiculously cheap, because you're thinking in 2016 you're paying 2.5 million for 99 years. As an indication, we've got the Rioch Arena, Coventry's previous currently. They're currently, you could argue, without a ground. I believe they're currently at St Andrews. They were at, I think, Northampton. Obviously, neither are necessarily amazingly close to Coventry. Good 30 miles away from Birmingham, realistically. 20 to 30. And they basically were renting what many would say a soulless stadium with a capacity of 40,000, or 32,000 if it's for football and rugby events. and they were renting it for 1.2 million in 2012. At this point, they'd have, I believe, been a championship club. 1.2 million, and since then I dare say it's gone up. So by the time West Ham were signing a deal in 2016, it's probably 1.5, 1.8 million. So 2.5 million in London's ridiculous. It's been a massive subsidy to West Ham. Here's the problem. If the company that owns the stadium isn't going to be financially viable, how does this situation survive? And the simple answer is it doesn't. I think what we'll probably see is that the stadium will reduce the staffing, i.e. the stewards, so there'll be less stewards in the stadium. I think as well during that period you'll probably see West Hams, who are already upset with the current ownership, continuing to show their discontent, and that's going to lead to crowd trouble. And then when the crowd trouble spills out because you've not got enough stewards, someone's going to have to be to blame, and it's going to just be a game of, oh well, it's your fault, you didn't have enough stewards, we can't afford the stewards. We can't afford the stewards we've got. We need more money. And that's going to be the argument. And everyone probably thinks, oh, it's okay. It's a subsidy, so the British government, or I think it might even be the London Council, will step in and they'll just pay the bill. Well, I'd take a look at the current finances of the UK during the COVID period and maybe reassess that. Because there isn't money bailing out football clubs or stadiums. We're then thrown into, well, what would happen? Well, if the stadium goes into administration, it could be sold off for redevelopment. West Ham's lease might be ended. I think that's unrealistic, but it's a possibility. It will be a long and drawn-out possibility, which is going to make everyone feel like utter guano, but it's a possibility. I think the more likely possibility is that the stadium will demand, due to the unruly fans, that they are going to argue they don't have other events they hold. You should pay for the stewarding. You should deal with stewarding. If you're going to rent it for 2.5 million, fine, but you take the costs on the stewarding, and that's going to be an extra big dollop of cost on the club. What do you do then? I mean, obviously you're now kind of committed to this 99-year lease, unless somebody can get it annulled. So you're stuck there paying extra, so you're going to be at a slight disadvantage ultimately, depending on the costs involved. And you're effectively paying the costs you were when you owned the ground, maybe not the maintenance, but you're going to be paying the costs, but you're not going to be getting the revenue from the concessions, because that's still going to be going to the stadium. So you're going to be out of pocket a bit. And you can't even go back to the bowling ground, because, hey, it's flats now. It's flats. You know, watch that property developer make a good couple of 100 million out of those flats. And remember, you got 38 million for your stadium. 38 million. And where's that money now? Because you're in debt. So there's no money to buy a new stadium, no money to build a new stadium, no land to build it on. You know, if the London Stadium does ultimately go, your best bet's probably going to be sharing with Tottenham. Don't know how you feel about that. Good news for Tottenham. They get some more money in to pay for their stadium, pay it off a bit quicker. Maybe they get the issues solved, but I mean, if the stadium's making 3.5 million when it's a specialist running it, do you think handing it over to a committee of people who know nothing really about running stadiums, do you think they're going to be able to do a better job? I don't. I think the situation's untenable. I think ultimately it's going to come back and be a pain. Obviously, there's a long period for that to occur. But I mean, it is an inevitability because we're going to have inflation. And if you're just still paying 2.5 million, you know, and the average British worker, say in 50 years, because of some major financial crisis, of which there are many that we're going through, imagine that happens, and suddenly, you know, the average man in the streets on minimum wage is getting paid 3 million. Stadium's not going to exist. Obviously, that's an extreme. It's happened in history. Look at Germany. Look at the 1970s in Britain. You know, the oil crisis and the wage crisis. 1979, you could buy a paperback book for 40p. In 1983, it's £4. Doesn't have to be that as bad as a German situation. It can be relatively low but protracted over a period of time, and suddenly 2.5 million is not the great figure it used to be. It's not good, or at least long term it's not good. I think even in the short term it's probably not good. I think the fact that if at the beginning of the contract companies can't make a profit, it means that the initial agreement was at least suspect, if not out and out, I don't want to say fraudulent, but it was out and out one-sided. And here's another problem for West Ham. You know, clubs that own their stadium don't necessarily have to pay rent. So if the stadium's not full of people, you're not having to pay for stewards, well, you're not losing any money, it's not the worst in the world. But if you're paying rent, regardless of whether there's fans in the stadium or not, yeah, you're saving the cost of the stewards, although you're not paying the cost of the stewards anyway, so actually you're not saving anything there at all. So yeah, you're still paying 2.5 million for something that's not bringing in any money. That's going to be a bit of a drag. I mean, yeah, 2.5 million's cheap, but it's 2.5 million other clubs aren't having to spend you. It's going to be interesting to watch what happens with the London Stadium over time. I think, unless they've linked the payments to inflation, I think it's inevitable that this is going to be a situation that can't be resolved unless the formula changes. Well, those are my thoughts. We'll see how it goes. I'll be keeping an eye.